Hi everybody, I'm Charlie, and this is On Air, my Beatles collection. Today I'm going to talk about the Beatles Anthology video, as shown on Disney+. I promised in the last video that I would watch all 9 episodes and then comment, rather than comment each night after each of the 3 episodes for that night were made available. So a lot of people have already been out there with their opinions. I want to start by saying I do not have photographic memory, either in my eyes or my ears. I don't have discriminating vision for high-tech versus lower-tech video quality. I think I can tell when something looks good and when something doesn't look as good. I think I can tell when something used to not look so good and now it looks a lot better. As far as photographic memory in my ears, if such a thing exists, as you all know if you follow the channel, I have thousands, literally many thousands, of versions of every song the Beatles ever did in a studio, in a living room, whatever. Alternate takes. I can't remember one alternate take from the other. I do have the new Anthology LP collection. I also have the CD version. I also have streaming from Amazon Music. So I have heard, I think I've heard everything, every take that's ever been released on a bootleg or on video or audio or wherever it is. But don't ask me which take is which. When I got the Anthology Volume 4, or let's say Anthology 4, that portion of the 12 LP set, I don't even remember which takes were repeats from the Super Deluxe boxes. I have all the Super Deluxe boxes. I've listened to all the Super Deluxe boxes, but I didn't take to memory which take of which song was what, and my ears don't remember either. So a lot of it sounds new to me, even though I already have it in another source. So all of that said, I was kind of surprised to read and hear some of the reviews of the Anthology video series on Disney+. It amazes me that people can actually remember a missing couple of words out of a line that was in the original ABC version or the VHS version, which I have, or the Laserdisc version, which I have, or the DVD version, which I have. I never studied those. I've watched them all. I don't watch them every year. I haven't watched them in several years. I enjoyed them in their time. There was enough space in between the ABC original broadcast in 1995 and when the various different media were released. I think DVD came out in like 2003. So, over that period of time, I watched all of them at least a couple of times, but I didn't take them to memory. And so I was surprised to see a lot of the criticism, where criticism was offered. It wasn't always negative, but where the criticism was negative, in many cases it was, oh, we're getting gypped, the DVDs were much longer, and this scene is missing, and that scene is missing, and these words are missing, and those words are missing. I don't have any of those memories of the original home video versions that I just mentioned. I just remember that I enjoyed it each and every time I watched it, and I enjoyed it this time. There was new stuff to be had in the new version. I think that Disney Plus was working from the base initially of the ABC broadcast from 1995, not the home video version, which was expanded. They put a lot of extraneous stuff in there. It wasn't in chronological order. They put extra stuff in there. It was nice to have. A lot of DVDs have special features and, separate discs with additional features and that sort of thing. But Disney Plus was working with the original ABC version, and they cut some stuff out and they added some stuff in. And most importantly, and this is kind of my opening comment here before I get into my actual view of the the individual episodes, the video quality and the audio quality is phenomenal compared to any of those that I mentioned. And if you think of DVD as being the highest available recorded version of the Beatles Anthology in 1995, because there is no Blu-ray. So if you think of the DVD as the highest quality, I would suggest that anybody that watched the Disney, before they comment about the crappy quality, they ought to go back and look at the DVD. The version that was just broadcast and is still available in streaming and will be available for who knows how long. They still have Get Back and they still have Let It Be on Disney Plus. So they're going to have this on there for a long time. If you want to compare them side by side, you'll be surprised how much better this version is over even the DVD, which came out, 6, 7, 8 years after the original ABC TV broadcast. So if you're wondering at all, is this worth watching? Because I read all this stuff. People are griping they're missing this. They cut this out. They added this. They took that out. I don't know. I'm a Beatle fan. I have a big investment in my lifetime in the Beatles as a group. I have a big investment as a collector. I have this channel here. I have a Facebook page with almost 6,000 followers there. The Beatles have played a big part in my life. But I don't I don't nitpick over, this frame looks a little washed out compared to that frame, or, this sounds a little different than that does. And I just enjoy it all. Honestly, I just enjoy it all. I've seen criticism that, that there is untruth in some of this, that they whitewashed their career to some degree. And the talking about untruth, there are things that are true and there are things that are not true. All the things that are not true are not automatically lies, however. It doesn't mean there's an intentional attempt to not tell the truth. It just means sometimes people have their own truth. They see the world through their own eyes. And so sometimes what they think they saw and what they think they remember is not exactly what happened. There was plenty of evidence of that in this video, where they would ask all three surviving Beatles at the time, but also had tape of John from when he was alive. And they asked the same question, and they got 4 different answers, or at least 2 or 3 different answers. The thing that really surprised me the most is that when they showed, when they were getting towards the end of their touring days, and, they showed the Philippines, and they showed all the different places where they went, where they're having trouble. And it amazed me when they talked about the second time you played at Shea Stadium, and both George and Ringo separately said, "Did we played there twice?" They didn't even remember playing there twice. And Ringo always has a line to follow that, usually a comedy line, said, "Were we any good?" So, if somebody thinks they're lying about how many times they played at Shea Stadium, they're not lying. They just don't remember. They literally did not remember that they played there twice. And a lot of fans don't know that, because everybody talks about 1965, but they were there in 1966, only 2 weeks, I think, before, maybe a week, before their last ever live performance on tour at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. So anyway, that's a long preface to what, I want to tell you about the video. I will give you, a warning that if you haven't watched the whole thing yet, the spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you all the way through, episode 1 through 9 of my impressions and what I saw there. But I'll just give you a quick run over. So I have some notes. I'm going to look at my notes. I also did want to mention one other thing. I noticed that I have iTunes or Apple Music and Spotify, but I don't really use Spotify. I use Apple Music, and I noticed that after each day when 3 more episodes were released, they released a album. I'll put that in quotes, an album of the soundtrack for those 3 episodes. So now there are 3 soundtracks sitting there, for streaming or download, that basically they're not truly soundtracks in the sense that it isn't exactly what you heard if you watch those 3 episodes. Even if there was a snippet of a song, playing while they were talking, or just, maybe they played, in some cases they played, 30 seconds of a song and then they faded and they moved to something else. If they did that, that song is in this soundtrack LP that's available online. So there's one for each day. And I know there's a lot of songs in there. I forget how many, but there's 20 or 30 songs in each of those groups. So it has no relationship to the Beatles Anthology audio that was released as CDs and LPs. That's a different thing. That's all alternate takes and all that stuff. This is just every song that was mentioned during those 3 episodes each night. And each day they released a soundtrack album to accompany that. And that sound is great. Now, there's not too much of it is remixed. So it's all different mixes from, all different eras. Most of them are, post 2000 mixes, not, the original mixes from, not from the 60s. Most of them are remastered and, remixed sometime in the last 20 years, let's say. And I won't go through that. You can go online yourself and figure out what all that's about. But I did want to say that it's not just 3 nights or 9 episodes of video. It looks great. It sounds great. And in addition to that, you can go onto your Spotify or your Apple Music account and you can listen to all those songs again in glorious Dolby Atmos or whatever you have. So anyway, enough said. So the first night would have been Wednesday night. Just a couple of nights ago. As I'm talking to you now, it's Saturday night. So I finished the 9 episodes last night. Had some stuff to do today, and as promised, here I am to talk about all 9 episodes. So it opened with a sort of a montage of pictures throughout the Beatles' career with "In My Life" playing to accompany what you might think of as a slideshow. And then he just started talking to the Beatles about the 50s and how they became a group and all that, and what inspired them to do this kind of music, and a couple of things that I remembered hearing before, but the first of which kind of surprised me, and it was Paul, and he said Elvis is really who got him thinking about how great this was to be in that position, and I quote, he said, "The Messiah has arrived." So to Paul, maybe he was, talking about his generation. Maybe he's talking about the rest of the band as well. But the Messiah has arrived. Elvis got their attention, and made them want to do it. And John's quote, you probably heard a million times, but John said, "That's a good job." So he knew what he wanted to do for a living after he saw Elvis doing it. So then there was, and there's been a lot of controversy about this next point online. How they got their name, the Beatles. And it started with the mythology of, the man on a flaming pie came and said, "You will be Beatles" with an A, which John originally just kind of made up, as a humorous thing to say. But then he talks about how he and Stu used to, talk about names, and John kind of liked thinking about the Crickets and how, they took a name that, you wouldn't think would be a rock and roll name, but Buddy Holly made it a rock and roll name. And so they thought of Beatles. And then I believe it was Stu that said Beatles with an A. Then you have Beatles. And now you have a double meaning. And an interesting thing that I saw that was positive about that was how now, years later, for our generation anyway, people of a certain age, as they say, even when they hear about the little insect, they think of the band first. If somebody says Beatles, even the car, the Beetle, the Volkswagen Beetle, people have a tendency to misspell it with an A, and they have a tendency in their brain to think of the group before they think of the car or the insect. So anyway, but a lot of people I've seen writing online about the evolution of the name and how it came about, and the people said they're lying about that, and they're making stuff up about it. I don't know the truth. All I know is what I heard John say with his own with his own voice when he was not goofing around talking about flaming pies. He was talking about wanting to have a name, similar to what the Crickets did, and he came up with Beatles, and then his friend Stu Sutcliffe, introduced the idea that maybe Beatles might be better. So anyway, you can believe what you want. And then the other thing that I've heard many times, but I heard, the back and forth between John and the band. Where are we going, fellas? To the toppermost or the poppermost? I always smile when I hear that. They hadn't gotten there yet. And so then they introduce, in this, again, we're still in episode 1, they introduce Brian Epstein, excuse me. They repeatedly say it that way, so I'm going to say it that way from now on, Brian Epstein. Of course, Brian heard about them. Kids were coming into his record store looking for the record by the Beatles, and he heard that they were playing right down the road in the Cavern, and he went to see them, and I think you know the rest of the story. Brian took over after that. They then, in episode 1, they talk about going to Decca on New Year's Day. Driving down from Liverpool down to London on New Year's Eve, and doing the demo stuff for Decca that we've all heard on bootlegs for many years now, and how Dick Rowe at Decca said, guitar groups are going out of. I think he said guitar groups are on the way out, and that's what he told Brian. Brian took the demo around, finally got to George Martin, who just liked something. I don't know, in his brain he felt something might be here. Wasn't necessarily what he heard on the tape, but he just felt like this was worth a shot. And so they came in and did some work for George Martin, who told them privately that the drummer needed to go. That was still Pete Best. The next time they got there, they had hired Ringo, of course, but George didn't know that. So he had brought in Alan White to play drums on whatever they were going to do. Hence, Alan White wound up on the single version of Love Me Do. And he has Ringo to step aside. After which, in the video, Ringo mentions, but it's me on the album version of Love Me Do. So that was good to see. And that was pretty much the end of the first episode. There was a lot of other, stuff going on in between. The episodes are about 52 minutes each. And with commercials, it takes you to about an hour for each episode. So 9 hours over 3 days. It's kind of a big commitment. But anyway, I actually did 3 hours one day, no hours on Thanksgiving, and 6 hours on Friday. So commitment is whatever it is. So episode 2 basically starts in the Please Please Me era, where George Martin has accepted them, and they did Love Me Do, and they had a minor hit. I think they said it went to number 17. Of course, it wasn't released here in the U.S., and I don't know. I don't think it was released throughout the world. It was basically an England thing. And then George Martin had them do one 12-hour session, he said, from 10 a.m. to 11 p.m., which seems like 13 hours to me, but he called it one 12-hour session. Maybe he said that, and one of the Beatles said, we worked from 10 in the morning till 11 at night, so that's 13 hours. But anyway, that was to record the Please Please Me album. So when you go back and you listen to Please Please Me album, think in terms of this was all recorded in one day, which is pretty amazing. And, so they bounce around in the video, playing some of those songs. They also mentioned that a lot of these songs came from our stage act. We knew these songs really well. So, if we could do them in 1 or 2 takes and maybe some overdubs or whatever. But, for the most part, this was stuff we were very familiar with doing. And of course, they got to introduce Please Please Me, which was Lennon and McCartney composition. And, George Martin recognized that immediately. He says, boys, I think you have your first number 1. So anyway, so that was all good to see. And then, they showed them, when there was still kind of a second tier or even a third tier act touring in the UK with a van. Along the way, they picked up Mal pal, Evans. He kind of joined the party and, you know, became their roadie and obviously stayed with them, you know, to the death, basically. Big thing for them was to get on BBC. They wanted to get on the BBC Saturday Club. So that's where they started. So there's some talk about that. Then one of the tours that I just mentioned wound up being a package tour with Roy Orbison being the top billing on that. And you know, over time, the Beatles became the top billing, of course, on those tours. There's also mentioned in episode 2 about writing "I Want to Be Your Man" for the Rolling Stones, and so they played the Rolling Stones version in the video, and then later on, when the Beatles recorded, they played their version of it later on in the video. There's a great video of "She Loves You" in there during that time. So now they're kind of growing in popularity towards the end of the second episode. They show them going to Stockholm, and you see a video of them doing Long Tall Sally. Then they come back to the UK, and by this time, people have really caught on, specifically in the UK, but starting to spread, you know, in other parts of Europe. And the press there coined the term Beatlemania. So they gave credit to the British press for coming up with the term Beatlemania. And then the next thing you see is the Royal Variety Show. They don't show a lot of that. The only thing they show is John with his famous, "For the people in the cheap seats, clap your hands. If the rest of you rattle your jewelry," irreverent John. The audience took it pretty well. They did Twist and Shout, and that's all they showed for the Royal Variety Show. So then they moved on to the recording with the Beatles. They're still flops in America at that point. They talk about the Capitol thing, you know, everything they sent over to Capitol rejected, Capitol in the U.S., that is. They didn't think, it was suitable for an American audience at that time. Along the way, I don't remember exactly where it was, but they did mention, of course, that Stu Sutcliffe had initially left the band, and then they also mentioned that he had passed away. I don't think there was much emphasis on that, actually. I'm trying to remember now. I mentioned before I don't have photographic memory, eyes, or ears. So it was in there. I know they mentioned that he left. I'm not sure about how much they got into his death. And, and they also mentioned Jürgen Vollmer and Astrid and Kirchner and, the whole German scene as well. That was mostly in episode 1. So then I mentioned that, they had recorded with the Beatles, and then they still had a problem in America with Capitol Records. So, they were sending stuff to smaller labels like Swan and Tolly and VJ, but none of that really was working yet. So all of those labels had the rights, and, they had some records out there, but nobody was buying them. And then I Want to Hold Your Hand hit, and Capitol pretty much said that this one sounds like it's going to make it. And contractually, they were obligated to promote it for a certain amount. So, of course, it took off. And so in January of 1964, the Beatles were in Paris. And, they talk about Paul saying that we said we won't go to America until we have a #1 there. Well, that's a little bit untrue. As much as he may have said that at the time, they were already destined to go to America for the Ed Sullivan Show. They had already been booked for 3 episodes of the Ed Sullivan Show in February. So they were going whether they had a #1 or not. But while they were in Paris, they got a telegram that said, you went to #1 in America with I Want to Hold Your Hand. So they kind of played that like, okay, now we can go to America. But, of course, they were coming anyway. So, is that an untruth, or is that, just the way you remember it? I'm sure Paul remembers them saying, we won't go to America until we have a #1. And there was some background discussion about that a lot of British groups had gone to America and nothing happened. Cliff Richard came here, nothing happened. So they didn't want to be one more on a list of failed British acts to come to America to try to, break that spell. But anyway, they did go to #1. like literally like a week before they got here. Um, so anyway, they were on their way anyway. Um, so that was pretty much, you know, the end of episode 2 was that they're in New York City. You know, they arrive and Ed Sullivan announces them, and then that's the end of episode 2, and we move on to episode 3. Episode 3 begins at JFK Airport and the press conference and all the stuff that you might remember, you know, talking to the press in New York, who were basically set up to try to tear these guys down, but they were under their spell after a certain period of time. You know, you've all seen the quotes. You know, are you wearing wigs? You know, are you bald? Have you had, you know, how often do you have a haircut? And George says, I had one yesterday, and they all laugh. They ask, you know, can you sing something now? And they said, no, we need money for that. And it was also the quote about what would you tell others about how to be successful, and you know what do you have to do to be successful like this? And John said if we knew that, we'd manage other bands. You know, those weren't his exact words, but you know what I mean. So anyway, we got a lot of the JFK stuff, a lot of the stuff around the Plaza Hotel where they were staying, all the kids in the street and kids chasing the cars and people with video cameras. A lot of what we saw in the Maysles Brothers version of Beatles 64 that was on Disney Plus last year. So, you know, it's a lot of the same film. And then they were in Central Park before they actually did the Ed Sullivan Show, and that was just 3 of them. George had the problem with his throat, and he stayed in the hotel room and got some rest and some sleep, and they went to Central Park, and they were just looking around, and the photographers were following them and taking all kinds of pictures and stuff. And then they go to the Ed Sullivan Show, and of course Ed does his introduction, and the next thing you hear is "Close your eyes and I'll kiss you." You know, "Oh my lover" was, of course, and they did show that whole thing. And then, you know, after the Ed Sullivan, they showed him on the train to D.C., to Washington D.C., and they mentioned that now that the press that had started out basically against them, trying to make them look foolish or ask them tough questions or just criticizing them, they were all buddies now. So they were enjoying the train ride down to D.C. together, and the press were kind of on their side now. So they really kind of won them over. And of course, next thing you see is they're in the Washington Coliseum. They're doing "She Loves You." I saw her standing there. And the thing that I noticed in the whole Washington Coliseum thing, it was definitely much, much cleaned up video-wise and audio-wise. I remember from the original tapes where John's mic was out or it was low or something. You couldn't really hear him. And, you know, just the sound just was terrible, but it was great. And the sound was really good. And the other thing that I noticed more than anything, Ringo was beating the hell out of the drums, and I saw her standing there. And, you know, there was a little conversation about, he would say how he would do that just to try to drive the thing, and he couldn't do a lot of fills and stuff. He would just, you know, pound on it to keep the beat. And he was beating the heck out of the drums, and it sounded great. I'm not criticizing it. It sounded great. Then they go, after the Coliseum thing, they go to the British Embassy in Washington, and it didn't turn out to be a happy night. You know, John says, "I just left in the middle of it," quote, unquote. Ringo had somebody cut hair off the back of his head, like I don't know, half an inch of hair off the back of his head as he was walking through the crowd. So they didn't have good memories of that, and they basically snuck out and didn't want to go back. Next thing you see is them in Miami, which Ringo described as paradise. You know, it was winter. It was the middle of February, and there they were in Miami in swim trunks and, you know, playing in the water and, you know, hanging around by the pool and so on. And then, of course, they were staying at the Deauville Hotel, which is not there anymore. The first thing you saw them rehearsing "This Boy," and John kind of goofed it up in the rehearsal, and he sang "That Boy" when you should sing "This Boy." And so they showed that, and then a few minutes later, they're on stage live on the Ed Sullivan Show, and the first song they do, or the only song they show on the video, is "This Boy." And the first line of the song, John sings "That Boy," and then George and Paul are standing beside him, and he's in the middle, and one mic, and right off the bat, the first word out of his mouth is "that boy" instead of "this boy." So I thought that was amusing. I had seen that before, but that's one of those things I forgot, and then I was reminded of it. And so, at some point in that sequence there, Ringo says, "Well, we've conquered America." So the next thing you see is they're back in the UK, and there's a big sign at the airport, "Welcome home, boys." Anyway, and they're asking him questions. How did you find America? John with the turn left at Greenland. But seriously, Paul is asked, what did you see as the difference? And he said, well, the accent was the only difference. So in other words, people said the same things, but they said it with an accent that was different than their accent. One of the things they also mentioned is people saying, how come you talk like you're British, but when you sing, you sound like you're, American? They didn't have an answer for that, but anyway, a lot of us used to say that back in the day, and I remember we used to say, gee, if you listen to the records, they don't sound foreign, foreign meaning, British as opposed to us Americans. But then you heard them talk, and they're like, oh, they all have British accents. What's that all about? Anyway. And so then moving on through episode 2, next thing you see is they're in production for A Hard Day's Night, the movie. So there's talk about that, and there's video on that, and there's, so it's really background stuff. They mentioned that Patty Boyd is in the movie, and Ringo eventually marries her. They show Paul's grandfather. His grandfather in the movie, of course. Then they mentioned John's book in his own right. And then somewhere along the line, they picked up Derek Taylor, who was a member of the press, but he became their press officer. And then they go to the Netherlands, and Ringo has tonsillitis and has to have his tonsils removed. So they bring Jimmy Nicol into the band. And I think a lot of you know the sad story of Jimmy Nicol. He was a Beatle for, I think, 11, 12 days. And then he went off into anonymity after that. There's a famous picture of him sitting at the airport in Australia, and there's like nobody else in the airport. He's just sitting there with his head in his hand, and that's kind of the end of anybody's remembrance of Jimmy Nicol. Anyway, he sat in quite professionally. He was there for the Netherlands. He was there with them in Hong Kong, which they hated. They were very surprised that they mentioned that I think John was the one that mentioned. They thought they'd see a lot of Oriental people, but they saw mostly British Army people. Of course, Hong Kong was under British control then, and so they said it was really more British Army personnel that we interacted with and that met us and so on. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. Then off to Australia, and Ringo comes back while they're in Australia, and Jimmy Nicol departs, and they showed a little bit of their Beatles at Festival Hall, which is one of the great live Beatles bootlegs, what they did at Festival Hall. But they showed that a little bit of that, and then episode 2 ended with the premiere of the Hard Day's Night movie. So that was they showed them each of the primary members of the movie walking the red carpet and going, of course, in black and white, it wasn't a red, but anyway, they were walking into the premiere. So moving on to episode 4. That was episode 3, right? Yeah, was it? I'm going to make sure I don't skip any episodes here. Yeah, that was episode 3. Yeah, when they arrived at JFK, it was episode 3. So episode 4, one of the first quotes that I remember was George saying, everybody got into the mania. George, throughout his time as a Beatle, and certainly anytime he talks about the Beatles, post-Beatles, after they broke up, he doesn't say a lot of things that are fond remembrances of the time. He didn't like the crowds. He didn't like the fact that they didn't have any anonymity. He just didn't like a lot of things. And he talks a lot about the mania and how crazy it all was, and how they had to give up their in fact, one of the last thing he says in episode 9 is about, we gave our nervous system, meaning, they lost it. They lost their desire, or he at least did. Anyway, so let's see. Right after he mentions that, the mania, you see the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl. So, and again, you hear them doing All My Lovin' live. And then they start mentioning Bob Dylan and Elvis and going to Elvis's house. They also mentioned that they did 32 shows in 34 days. So this would be the American tour later in 64. This is where they start talking about drugs too. They talk about Dylan and pot kind of in the same breath. And, so they talk about, pretty openly about their, I won't say their love for it, but their interest in smoking weed. I don't think they call it weed. They say marijuana. They say pot. Of course, George usually says we tea. He talks about, we stepped outside for some tea, that sort of thing. George never wants to actually say the words. And they talk about going to Elvis's house, and Elvis has got a bass. He's playing a bass guitar, and he's got the TV on in the background. And they said they were kind of amazed that they were going to his house, but they weren't really impressed. And one thing they did say, they were high on the way to Elvis's house, and they actually forgot where they were going. And then they're like, "Oh yeah, we're going to Elvis's house." Like, we forgot. So that whole sequence was kind of weird. And for me, I grew up in the same era, so I'm not I'm not a baby about this kind of stuff. I know, to be honest, they had to mention all the drugs, but for me, it was actually a distraction to hear about it. I already know about it, and it came up a lot from this point on. Just the whole talk about pills in Germany, and then pot, and then eventually LSD, and all that. So I don't want them to sanitize and whitewash the video, but I didn't really appreciate how many times they felt the need to keep talking about that, but they did anyway. And then let's see, they talk about John inventing feedback, and using that as for the beginning of I Feel Fine, and they talked about that a little bit. Then there was an interview with Brian Matthews, and then Paul told the story about how he was going out to John's place, and he wasn't eligible to drive because he, I forget what he said, he had his license suspended for a period of time. And he asked the driver if he was pretty busy, this time of year and all that, and the driver said, "Oh, I'm working 8 days a week." So Paul said when he got to John's house, they wrote a song called 8 Days a Week. So he got that title from the what we would call now an Uber driver. Oh, there was no Uber in those days, of course. And that kind of was the segue into the Beatles for Sale album. Paul had a funny comment. He said when the album came out, he didn't realize when they took the photograph for the cover until he saw it, and he said George had a turnip top. They zoomed in on the top of George's head, and he had what we call here in the States a cowlick. Just had kind of a thing sticking up on the middle of the top of his head, and Paul called it a turnip top. I had never heard that expression. Next thing you know, they're in production for the Help movie. You got Paul saying, "Well, we've never been to the Bahamas. Can we go there? We've never been skiing. Can we go skiing?" So that kind of resulted in them writing into the movie the need to be in these exotic places. So I kind of knew that already, but I had not actually heard them say that before. And then they showed Ticket to Ride, and they showed them doing Help live. And then they showed Paul doing Yesterday. Of course, George said before that, Paul McCartney from Liverpool, opportunity knocks. And then Paul did Yesterday by himself, which he said, terrified him. He mentioned that they never made it a single because, at least not in the UK, they didn't make it a single initially because he sounded like he said they didn't think it was appropriate to put out a Beatles record with only one Beatle on it, and plus they were a rock and roll band, so he didn't think it was an appropriate single. He says. Now, I don't know what he said at the time. You know, the ones that are alive have the ability and the editorial license to continually rewrite history and either say it the way they remember it or say it the way they want you to hear it. So who knows? I don't know. I don't know what happened and what didn't. And funny thing, after Paul finishes, the rest of the band comes back on stage. John gives him flowers and says, "Thank you, Ringo. That was wonderful." So only John could get away with that. Next thing you know, they're getting their MBEs from the Queen, so they meet the Queen. There's some video on that. And the next thing you know, you're right at the end of episode 4, and Ed Sullivan is introducing them at Shea Stadium, but that's where it ends. So, needless to say, episode 5 starts with that same intro, Ed Sullivan on stage introducing them again, and they come out on stage, and they show Twist and Shout being the opening track. And as the Beatles did a lot on that tour, it's the abridged version. The editors didn't cut it, you know, for the video. They did it, you know, an abridged version of the song. And John wanted to get through it fast, I think. So they did an abridged version of it. And then they did Babies in Black and I'm Down and Help. And John was clowning around through a lot of it. You know, for I'm Down, he's doing this on the keyboard. And him and George are singing into a mic. John's sitting. The mic's up here, George is above him, and, you know, John is doing the keyboard and singing up there. But he's goofing around, you know, as only John could do. And then the next thing, they start talking about the Rubber Soul album. And you hear a little bit of Drive My Car and Girl and If I Needed Someone. Of course, George discovers the sitar. He's listening to Ravi Shankar. He discovers a guitar. He said he went out and bought a cheap one. And he decided Norwegian Wood needed something. And so he, of course, as we all know, he added that to Norwegian Wood. What they played was an alternate take. They didn't play the actual final recording of it, but they played it when George was still kind of fingering his way through that. And then at the end, you hear Paul say, "Plastic Soul Man." So another famous quote. And the next thing you know, they're moving on to Revolver album, and you hear a little bit of Any Bird Can Sing, Good Day Sunshine, Eleanor Rigby, I'm Only Sleeping. And then you hear, you know, what we've really heard, I think, for the first time on a Super Deluxe edition recently, where John starts writing what would become Yellow Submarine. And he sings slowly, "In the town where I was born, no one cared." So he sings that in the movie, which was definitely not in the original Beatles Anthology video on ABC. I don't remember if it was on the DVD. I don't think so. I think the first time we actually heard that early version was you know, on the Super Deluxe box, and I don't even remember which one. I guess it would have been the Revolver box that we heard that. So yeah, that makes sense, right? So anyway, but that's kind of the birth of Yellow Submarine, even though it didn't have a name yet, and it was a totally different meaning and feeling at that point. Then you hear a little bit of Taxman, Tomorrow Never Knows. There's a lot of times you hear about that in the video. Nowhere Man, and then they start talking about LSD and how they were first introduced to it, and they didn't even know that a dentist. They were at dinner with them, and he slipped it into their drink. So that was kind of weird. In the background, they start playing Dr. Robert, which of course is about, you know, a drug supplier. Anyway, Dr. Robert was on that album. And then they show the promo film for Paperback Writer and Rain. And they mentioned that they weren't touring anymore, so they started doing videos. George said, "We invented MTV." And they show the video where Ringo introduces the video when he says, you know, "We're doing this because, you know, we're all busy with the washing and the cooking." So I thought that was funny. I'd seen that before. Of course, we've all seen the video. But I still smile when I see it. It's not like I see it every day. So, it still catches me by surprise sometimes. As soon as the video comes on, I don't automatically go to hearing Ringo say that. And then when he does, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that. It's funny. So anyway, and then they did, they showed and played some of the Christmas message from 1965. So that was there. And then they're off to Japan. Still in episode 5, they're off to Japan, and they go to Budokan, a place that I've been, by the way. And they start with rock and roll music, which sounds great. They do an electric version of Yesterday, which is, of course, interesting. That full band playing Yesterday on electric guitars and drums and the whole thing. And they kind of mentioned that they kind of got in trouble in the Japanese press, maybe in the Japanese public a little bit, because they were basically defiling, the Budokan, which was a sacred place where there's only martial arts are supposed to happen there. And they're thinking, what's so sacred about martial arts, but the place was full. The audience enjoyed the shows. And, so anyway, what they're hinting at now is, in the video, they're hinting at touring sucks, for want of a better way to put it. And, no matter what you do, you get in trouble. And here we are, we did a concert that people enjoyed, that was sold out, and yet we got to read, in the press that, that we defiled the Budokan. Anyway, when I went there for judo. So anyway, then they're off to the Philippines, which I have one word written on my notes here. Ugh. They hated the Philippines. Again, they got in trouble because they were invited to meet the president and his wife, Marcos and Imelda Marcos. You might remember those names. Imelda Marcos became famous later for having, like hundreds of pairs of shoes or whatever. Anyway, they never showed up for dinner at the palace. They didn't even know. They claimed that they didn't even know they were invited. They didn't show here, but we saw back in the video The Complete Beatles, and maybe we saw it in the ABC anthology. I'm not sure. They put them on the back of a flatbed truck, and they were going through the airport in the rain with the umbrellas blowing out of their hands. They didn't show any of that, but that was all part of the original discussion in the earlier videos and earlier, biographies about them starting to really hate being on the road. So episode 6 starts, that's the end of episode 5. Episode 6 starts with basically the theme that touring sucks, and also the Beatles are bigger than Jesus thing in the U.S. So they had videos of the Ku Klux Klan claiming to be a religious organization, saying, they wanted to stomp out the Beatles, basically. They showed the, DJs asking them to, bring their Beatles records and paraphernalia in and burn it. And they showed some of the burning. And then they went to Shea Stadium again for 66. Ringo and George both said, as I mentioned before, did we play there twice? Yeah, you did. And again, Ringo said, were we any good? And then, of course, Candlestick Park was only a couple of weeks after that. And that was the end. They were done with touring. They showed a little bit of Candlestick Park. And then there was a kind of a montage of all of their live stuff over the years. And obviously they're basically showing you this is this is the summary of their touring years. And so touring ends is basically the theme there. Then they mentioned John going off to shoot the movie How I Won the War. He got a call from Dick Lester, who had done A Hard Day's Night and Help. And he went off to do How I Won the War. George went off to India. Paul went off with George Martin to write the score for Family Way. So that's that basically what they did after they stopped touring. They didn't mention what Ringo did. But then they're back in the studio in early '67, and of course they got pushed for a single. So the first one they talked about was Strawberry Fields, then Penny Lane, and they showed both videos, both of the original videos for Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields. And then, of course, that segued into Sgt. Pepper album, we all know that they originally thought those two songs would be on the Sgt. Pepper album, but they got pushed, by the by the record companies to get a single out. So anyway, the other thing that was kind of mentioned, kind of loosely, was that people were asking, are you breaking up? You're not going to tour anymore? What are you going to do? So they felt the need to get something out there to prove that they were still a band. They just didn't want to tour anymore. So they mentioned the Sgt. Pepper album and all the stuff around that, and they play the tail end of the first Sgt. Pepper, going into With a Little Help from My Friends. Then they play for the benefit of Mr. Kite, and they show John pointing to the poster that inspired that. And then they talk about A Day in the Life, and Paul mentions how John got a lot of those lyrics, 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire, and he blew his mind out in a car. All that stuff was from the newspaper he was reading, when he wrote the song. And then this is the same period where somebody interviewed Paul and asked him, do you take LSD? And, Paul basically scolded him. You shouldn't ask this question, because I'm not going to lie to you, but I'm also not promoting the taking of LSD. And, you're going to put it in the press, and, people are going to have an opinion about that. And of course, that's exactly what happened. I think it was George that talked about it later, and he almost implied that Paul should have lied, and he shouldn't have even mentioned it. That he shouldn't have even brought it up. But, it wasn't Paul's idea. He got asked, and he answered the question, but he scolded the reporter for asking the question, because, what purpose does this serve? Now you're creating, something for people to talk about and to have an opinion about, and maybe to go do, because the Beatles do it. So anyway, there was quite a bit about that. Now then, that juxtaposed with their writing A Day in the Life, and Paul says to John, this we're trying to figure out how to segue from John's part to Paul's part, and then from Paul's part, to the ending. And he said they talk about, do we say, I'd love to turn you on? Are we conscious of what we're saying there, and are we going to say it anyway? And of course, they decided to say it anyway. George Martin then, at some later point in the video, says, it got banned. The song got banned, and I don't know why. It's a shame, and all that stuff. And then Paul talked about the piano ending, and he actually demonstrated on a piano. He hit that, that last chord, and he said, if you keep putting the mic in here deeper and deeper into the piano, and as he's talking, he keeps saying, see, you can still hear it. There, it's still there. It's still there. And that was one piano, and then he said how they got together with a bunch of pianos and did it. And then the next thing they were talking about, and they were talking about All You Need Is Love, which, as I recall, Sgt. Pepper came out here in early September, and All You Need Is Love was on the One World video thing in August. So Sgt. Pepper was still #1 on the charts here as an album. And there was no single at that point in time, and then All You Need Is Love came out as the single in August. And so there was, they showed the making of that, and they did have started out in black and white, and it turned to colorized. And they mentioned there were 200 million viewers for that, they expected. Don't be nervous, fellas. There's only 200 million people watching. And that was the end of episode 6. So we're in the home stretch here. I'm almost an hour into this. So I hope you're okay. I'm okay if you're okay. Episode 7, they talk about the love generation, and they show Haight-Ashbury in California. They played the Byrds 8 Miles High in the background. They don't explain it's the Byrds. They just play the song 8 Miles High. I was wondering if any of the uninitiated listening to that might have thought, gee, I didn't know the Beatles did that. But anyway, it was the Byrds. And then George talks about it as thinking, sort of romantically, what a cool thing this is going on out there. And then he was disillusioned when he got there. He thought they were all dropouts, druggies. He didn't like it at all. And he actually credited his trip there for turning him away from drugs and into, the whole Hindu, India thing. So that's good for him. And of course, we're not far away from the Maharishi now, because the next thing is the Beatles are together in England and they go to Bangor to see the Maharishi, to hear him. And while they're there, Brian Epstein dies. And one of the quotable quotes from John is, "We've had it now." And George at one point says, when they're talking about, the business side of things and all the things that Brian says, he said, "We didn't know anything. We were just Beatles. We didn't know anything." Then we segue back to Magical Mystery Tour, and Paul says, "I kind of directed it." He said, "But we gave credit to the Beatles, but I kind of directed it." I wasn't sure how to take that. And then they mentioned it was broadcast in black and white on Boxing Day, and it bombed. People didn't get it. It didn't look right in black and white. The press completely demolished it. They hated it. Anyway, the next, so they kind of talk about all that, and Paul, whenever he's asked about it, always says, "Well, it's the only place you can go to see a video of I Am the Walrus." So there's redeeming points there. Okay. And he also mentioned that Steven Spielberg told him that they dissected it in school, and that it was something they studied for modern filmmaking or whatever. So he kind of puffed up his chest a little bit about that. Anyway, and then they start talking about Apple, and so, and you start to hear some. Well, they go to Rishikesh first. So right after they talk about Magical Mystery Tour, they start talking about Rishikesh, and they go there, and of course they wrote a lot of White Album songs there. They also talk about Apple as a label, and they mention James Taylor and Badfinger, Jackie Lomax, Mary Hopkin, so on. They just mention it. They don't declare victory regarding the company or the label. They just mention those, and they actually show. They also show James Taylor singing, a little bit of Jackie Lomax too. Let's see. Yeah, this is where George says the only thing we knew how to do was to be Beatles. So this is his way of saying Apple didn't really make it. Because we just didn't know how to do it. Then they start talking about the Yellow Submarine movie, and they actually show the Beatles doing it all together now at the end of the movie. And let's see, and so the next thing you see is they're in the studio, or in their life. You see Yoko Ono arrives, and they show John at the gallery where he meets her. They kind of very quickly go to They're in Love, and they did Two Virgins album, and Ringo has a funny quotable quote in there that I'll leave until you see the video if you don't know which one I'm talking about. Then there's more White Album stuff that they're playing in the background. And then, of course, while they're talking about the White Album, Ringo quits. He felt like he wasn't playing well, he said, and he felt like the others, had their special group. So he says he went to see John. And he said, "Well, I'm leaving, and it looks like you three guys, are, all together." And John says to him, "I thought it was you three guys." And then he goes to Paul, and he says the same thing. "I'm leaving the group. I don't feel good about myself, and it feels like you guys have your own thing." And Paul says, "I thought it was you three guys." So Ringo says that emphatically, and then the next thing they talk about, he returns, and George fills the studio with flowers, and they tell him he's the greatest rock drummer in the world and all that stuff. And then there's a little bit of the discussion about should the White Album have been 2 LPs or 1 LP, and George Martin kind of started that. So there's a little back and forth on that, and then of course Paul famously says, "It's the bloody Beatles White Album. Shut up." I always love that quote. And let's see. And somewhere in there, Ringo talks about months and months of misery, months and years of misery. So this was kind of the segue into the Beatles are starting to drift apart. I never got that sense anywhere else in Ringo's life. anything else, any interview he's ever given where he talked about months and years of misery. And he always talks so happily about, oh, that was great. Oh, I enjoyed that. Oh, that was so much fun. So I don't know why they picked that quote to sort of introduce you to, you know, that the bloom was a little bit off the rose, so to speak. And that's the end of episode 7. And you go into episode 8, and they start basically with David Frost's TV program with the Beatles doing Hey Jude. And there's some discussion about how it originated as Hey Jules, because Paul felt, you know, bad. He was driving out to see Cynthia Lennon and Julian, and he had this thing in his head, Hey Jules, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better. But he didn't want to go with Jules, so he went with Jude. There's no mention of, but I've seen it in other videos where John originally thought Paul was talking to him, not his son, talking to him about, you know, about his situation with Yoko. Anyway, there wasn't a whole lot about that. And then they next thing you know, they're going in to do the Get Back, what turned out to be Let It Be stuff, and they start off at Twickenham, and of course they show what they left out of the Get Back, Peter Jackson's Get Back version of Let It Be. You know, where George says, whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it. You know, when George says famously to Paul, if you don't want me to play anything, I won't play anything at all. And then, of course, George quits right after that. So it's definitely, his quitting is definitely related to what Ringo had said before in the last episode and what just happened with him and Paul. And when he returns after, I don't know, they don't tell you how long, but I'm remembering from the movie, the Get Back and the Let It Be movie, it was a couple of days. You know, he kind of comes back with conditions. First of all, he wanted to move to Savile Row. He didn't want to be at Twickenham anymore. And then he also brings in Billy Preston, because he said the Beatles behave better when, you know, there's a guest in the room. And he was right about that, so they did. Then they show the Long and Winding Road, that, you know, the kind of the final video of Long and Winding Road. And they go up to the rooftop. They agree on that. They show Get Back. They show Don't Let Me Down. They show John's quote, you know, hope we pass the audition. And then they show the next day video of Let It Be. So that, I think, is the end of, no, it's not quite the end. No, next thing they show is Paul marries Linda, John marries Yoko, and Apple is losing money. So, of course, they decide, let's get George Martin back. Let's go do a real album the way we used to do it. George says, are you sure you want to do it the way you used to do it? Because, you know, he didn't want to be involved if they didn't want to. And I think he was still, you know, burned up about what happened with the Get Back / Let It Be tapes. I don't know if Phil Spector was already in the picture at that point. Maybe he probably was. Anyway, they get together to do Abbey Road, and they show a little bit of Come Together and a little bit of something. And Here Comes the Sun, Octopus's Garden. And then they mentioned that John had a bunch of snippets of things, Me, Mr. Mustard, Polythene Pam. They get the medley idea to tie it all together, which John didn't agree with. And, you know, then they play the end, you know, the song of the end. And then they talk to Ringo, and Ringo, to my eyes, cried. It looked like he cried talking about that was the end. It really was the end. And then you hear a John quote, nothing will ever break the love we have for each other. This is John talking in the 70s, you know, long after all the Poison came out and the competition with Paul and, you know, the songs that they wrote towards each other, How Do You Sleep and all that stuff. But John says, nothing will ever break the love we have for each other. And that's it for episode 8. And so the only episode that's left at this point is episode 9, and this is the new episode. And it starts with where they're looking back. So there they are in 1994, 1995, and they're looking back, and they're, you know, we see a little retrospective stuff in the video, and then we see the boys out on the lawn at George's place with the banjos and the, you know, the ukuleles. I said banjos, I meant ukuleles. And And then they went over to Abbey Road, not to play, but they were just in the studio, the three of them sitting there talking. That was left out of the original ABC for sure. I don't remember seeing anything where they were at Abbey Road talking about the past. Then they were at the console with George Martin, and they spent a fair amount of time with the Sliders talking about Tomorrow Never Knows. And then they're back at back at the house, and they're the Threedles now, my word, not theirs. They're doing Blue Moon of Kentucky. George is playing the acoustic guitar. Paul is too. Ringo's playing the brushes on the drums. And then you show a little bit of that, and then they show Paul where he says, quote, "What if there's a cassette of John?" And actually Ringo says that, and they show Paul saying it. And so they get the tape. Now, I've heard conflicting stories over the years whether Paul got the tape or George initiated that. What they say in the video is George asked Yoko and she said yes, and Paul was the one that went to get it. That's the way it plays out in episode 9. And then of course they have the tape, and they go into Paul's studio, and Jeff Lynne is there, and Paul says we decided to say John's on holiday. He started this stuff and he went on holiday, and he asked us to finish it. So that's what they do. So they show them working on Free as a Bird. They show them working on Real Love. They show a tiny bit of them working on Now and Then, and talking about, maybe we'll come back to that. George says, this ain't gonna work. Maybe we'll come back to it later. Of course, they came back to it, 30 years later. And then, then the whole thing kind of ends back on George's lawn, where they're doing H.E. Sweet, and George and Paul in harmony, and Ringo kind of just tapping on his legs because he doesn't have an instrument to play. And that's kind of the end. And they play Sgt. Pepper Reprise. I hope you have enjoyed the show. So, some of my comments after I saw that is, when it was on ABC TV back in the day, after the first night, they showed the Free as a Bird video. After the second night, they showed the Real Love video. And in this case, they didn't show any videos of those songs. So I know that the Free as a Bird video was cleaned up, and we've seen it on the Beatles channel and stuff. It was not they did not show it after the anthology ended. They didn't show Real Love. They didn't show the Now and Then video either. So let me just say my overall summary. I loved it. I thought it was great. I'm not a nitpicker about this is missing or that doesn't look the same or whatever. The video is tremendously improved quality-wise. The audio is tremendously improved quality-wise. And if you don't believe me, go back and watch your VHS tape or even your DVD, and then watch this. It's amazing. I've actually seen on a couple of places on the internet where people have video. They take still shots of the TV screen, or from the video, I should say, from the DVD. But they take a shot of the TV screen, and then above it they have the new one. And I mean, it's night and day. So I don't know how anybody could nitpick about that. I mean, some of the more technical video people, I see them saying, oh, they look washed out, this and that. It doesn't look right. It looks waxy. I don't know. My eyes and ears don't work the way other people's do, I guess, because to me the video looked phenomenal. I mean, as clean as could be. I didn't have any conflict with it at all, and the sound is phenomenal as well. Depending upon what kind of TV you have and whether you have surround sound or a center channel speaker or a boom, a bass box, a woofer, a subwoofer, depending upon what you have to hear it, that might have a lot of impact. If you're watching it on a 15-inch TV with a built-in speaker, it's probably not going to sound great. But if you have a modern television with a modern sound system, it's phenomenal. It's great. It sounds really good. So, I'm not into any of the complaints about that. There are the conflicting memories. that some people take as, untruths or even lies, but they're conflicting memories. They all, like I mentioned the Shea Stadium example, but there's plenty of others where they are not saying the same thing at all. And I don't know if they're making stuff up. I don't know if they remember it the way they remember it. I don't know if their remembrances are self-serving. I don't know if their remembrances are false humility, where they don't want to take credit for something that they should take credit for. So there is conflict between what they say as their answer to some things, but I just take it as, that happens in my own family, where, 3 people that are in the same place at the same time have 3 different recollections of what happened or what was said. So, I don't sweat that kind of stuff at all. There is a bit of whitewash. There are things that were left out that they could have talked about, and some of which they did talk about in earlier versions of this. But, I'm not going to try to list them. There's a lot of stuff out there, people saying, how come they didn't talk about this? How come they didn't talk about that? I don't know. This was made for a new generation using old stuff. There wasn't new stuff really to do now. The director intentionally did not talk to Paul or Ringo now about any of this. He didn't want their opinion 30 years after they talked about something that happened 25 years before they talked about it. If you catch my drift, there's 60 years between now and then, and he didn't want to have one more version of their memory, times 2 in this case of Ringo and Paul, and maybe he didn't feel it was fair not having any more John or George quotes to throw into it. So anyway, I think there was a bit of whitewash, and I think there was a little bit lost by not talking to current day Paul and Ringo. But I understand why the director felt that way, and clearly they're trying to appeal to 2 different audiences: a current, modern, younger audience, and then the original, first and second wave fans that kind of grew up with this stuff and remember the actual broadcast. The director said he was 15 at the time that the original ABC broadcast was on, and he only remembers it because his father watched it, and they only had one TV in their house, and the kids had to watch whatever the parents said. But he really wasn't into the Beatles, so so even the director was only 15. So he had his own biases when he saw the video, when he worked with the video clips that were available to him. So anyway, I think it was pretty well done. I was most satisfied with it. I asked my wife about it. She's a Beatle fan, but maybe 1/10 of the Beatle fan that I am. She was into the Doors and some other bands. She was also into the Monkees and the Partridge Family and stuff like that. So she wasn't a hardcore Beatles fan, and mostly her Beatles exposure over the last 35 years has been by being married to me. She loved it. She thought it was great. A lot of it was informative to her that was not as informative to me, because I've seen a lot of variations on this stuff, but I enjoyed having it all in one place. I haven't watched the original one in a long time, and a lot of it was, kind of a surprise to me, even though I've already been there and done that. And as I said, it looked and sounded great, so I was quite happy with it. People complained that they used less video than they had, that the DVD version, the episodes were over an hour and 20 minutes. These were 52 minutes. Of course, there were 9 episodes because they added a completely new episode, episode 9. So everybody's got whatever they want to say about it, but judge for yourself. If you haven't watched the whole thing yet, I hope I didn't give you too many spoilers on it. But I enjoyed it, and I think you'll enjoy it if you're a casual Beatle fan or if you're a Beatle expert. But if you're going to judge everything based on prior videos, and they left this out and they shouldn't have, and so-and-so said this back in 1967, how come that's not in here? And I don't play that game. So just have some fun. Watch, listen, enjoy, maybe shed a tear. You'll definitely smile more than once, and that's it. So sorry I took you well over the hour, and if you're still with me, thanks for hanging in there. If you're not, a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button. Come back and see a lot shorter videos. And certainly comment here if you agree, disagree, you want to debate anything, you want to tell me something I don't know, or you want to find out more from me, whatever comes to your mind, you want to put in the comment field. I'd be happy to see that. So that's it for now. Take care. See you soon.